you mentioned chromatography, and here you have flash chromatography. Do you want to kind of like what is flash? Because we hear color remediation chromatography. You and I talked about that yesterday, which is really just column chromatography at the end of the day. Then you hear flash chromatography. We've got things like thin layer chromatography, which if anyone's taken an organic chemistry class, that's those little silica plates and molecules will travel up it at different rates. We got medium pressure liquid chromatography, high pressure liquid chromatography. That's what we use in testing labs. Gas chromatography. What's your thoughts on it? Like, do you want to dive into it? Maybe define it for our viewers?
So, for chromatography as a whole, I can't necessarily say I can speak very well on the definition of it, but for flash chromatography in specific, so far it's been the more finalized version of the words that have been floating around the industry for about the last 10 years. I remember talking with you and you said this, and it was actually an experience of mine as well when I first started that learning CRC stands for color remediation column, and then having to learn that it actually stands for chromatography column. But where flash starts to play a portion in that is your regular chromatography is usually done with little silica plates like you were mentioning. And in this case with a hydrocarbon extractor, we're trying to aim for very high throughputs, and we have to get through our chromatography columns as fast as we can. And realistically, we're just kind of sending it through there for a very short amount of time on the way to our collection vessel. And with that, a lot of the times we're hitting it with some nitrogen for back pressure, anywhere typically around like 30 to 50 psi. I don't like going over that because I've seen a
Well,
lot
you
of
blow out your
people.
column.
Yeah, you blow out your column. Or I've even seen people start to express leaks in their system by going a little too hard too quick.
Yeah, and so that's basically flash is you're just making the process quicker, right? Whether that be with the added pressure from the nitrogen, potentially from your solvent like the butane that's already in the system. It's just flash chromatography is really just another name for CRC at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, at the end of the
Okay.
day. And it's also kind of a matter of the flow that you got going because, like you mentioned before, there's different types of pressures. You can go for like a medium flow chromatography or, a very fast, high throughput flash chromatography.
Yeah, and I think really equipment is going to be the big differentiator there, right? So, like a tried and true HPLC is something you would see in a compliance lab, whereas flash chromatography is going to be through like a 2 inch diameter column that's 24, 36 inches long. That's much different than, oh, fuck, I'm moving right now. So that's why I've got this big black drape behind me. But behind that, there's a million boxes. And in there, normally on my bookshelf, I have little HPLC columns, and they're like teeny. They're a couple millimeters in diameter, and they're maybe like the size of my finger, if that. Like, it's crazy the difference in size. And it makes sense though. These compliance labs, they don't need to push all the throughput that we are in a processing or manufacturing environment.
Yeah.
Cool. That was one that I was excited to like I highlighted just so that we could dive into it for like learning education's sake. But I'm glad that you put that in there because not many people have heard of flash chromatography. And to be honest, had I not taken my cannabis chemistry degree and been exposed to organic chemistry classes, I would not have known.
Genuinely same. I'd still probably be sitting here thinking CRC meant color remediation column myself.
Well, and that's what it does. It removes. So I guess we should really kind of like get into the basics of chromatography because we didn't really dive into that. How does it remove color? Do you want to dive into it? I could dive into it.
I'd love to dive into it a little bit if you'd be more willing to expand on it.
Yeah, yeah. Let's hear your kind of thoughts on how CRC or chromatography in general removes color, and then I'll kind of follow back.
Okay, sweet. So the process and how our medias for the CRC process interacts with the solvent is not through like a dissolved process. What happens is the solvent goes through the pores of the media that we have stacked in the column. And for example, color pigments, pesticides, heavy metals, so on and so forth, can actually get caught in those pores, stick to the media as it passes through, instead of the media, for example, being dissolved in the solution of solvents and it intermingling and there being some kind of chemical overlay between the two. And that's kind of where I see a lot of people get the misconception from, and why people are scared of CRC, because they think it can bleed into their end product. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if you know what pore size you're working with when it comes to your media, it should not be bleeding through. But that
Right.
also comes with keeping your checks in safe as well, and making sure you're not mixing anything up and have everything stacked properly.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, like everything in this world, once you know about it or you know how things work, it's not as scary anymore, right? Like once you know how to play with fire correctly, you now have a tool for a stove or warmth in a furnace instead of burning out in your house, or like a firearm. Like, it could be a tool or it could be a hazard really quickly. I think when it comes to the fear of products made by CRC, it's the same thing. To me, chromatography at its basic is just separation of compounds. And chromatography goes about that in many different ways, depending on the different types of chromatography you employ. And even within, like, we'll use HPLC, for example. If I want to do a compliance test, there's many different ways that I could go about separating all the individual compounds in a mixture and analyzing how much individual analyte is there. And that's just depends on what type of column I use. And chromatography at its base form, when it applies to cannabis, it's separation based on how quickly these compounds elute from the column. And what that means is that each compound is going to have a different molecular weight. So, or sorry, I should say each molecule has a different molecular weight. THC is going to weigh different than a terpene. It's much heavier. A lipid, which is a really long chain, is going to travel through this basically giant filter of sand at a different rate than terpenes will. And so all these molecules race through this column at different speeds because of their molecular weight, their shape, their interactions with the media, which is also known as the stationary phase, or their interactions with the solvent, which is known as the mobile phase. And as the mobile phase travels through the column, it's going to start to filter out and separate. And that's why you have different column lengths to choose from, because you might need a super long column to resolve out molecules that are really close in molecular weight. And you might need different pressures and all these different things. But at the end of the day, chromatography is just a tool for separating out compounds. And if the compounds we want to separate out or leave behind are just pigments, I don't see anything wrong with CRC.
Yo, I got to agree with you there. Because ultimately, a lot of people have negative things to say about it, but I've seen it used in very mild ways to where people can't even tell.
Yep. And that kind of like piggybacks on what you say here is with that, it's vital to know your media pore size. I imagine you're talking about there is the actual media in your column. If you have basically think of it like rocks for an over exaggerated example here compared to sand,
Well, they work as
you're
a sediment filter in water, so
yeah, exactly. So it's like your pore size is going to help control that flow through the column. Obviously, you don't want it too restrictive where nothing's going to flow, then nothing's going to resolve, or it's all going to get trapped at the bottom and elute out at the same time. But you also don't want massive pores where it's just flowing freely through and you're not having any separation.